7:15 in the morning, the Central Pacific. The Russian re-entry vehicle was already screaming through the upper atmosphere. It was moving at 27 times the speed of sound. This was not a standard ballistic trajectory. The object was gliding on a cushion of plasma. It was performing maneuvers that the American Aegis combat system classified as a physical impossibility. How could a weapon designed for spaceflight change direction inside the atmosphere? This question would determine the fate of the Pacific Fleet. The sky at 90,000 feet was a thin and dark violet. Below the vehicle, the Pacific Ocean was a vast and indifferent blue. The air here was too thin for wings, but thick enough for the hypersonic craft to grip. It glowed with a white heat. It looked like a falling star that had forgotten how to fall. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Preble, the mood was clinical. The destroyer was part of a routine tracking exercise. They were monitoring a Russian test launch from the Kamchatka Peninsula. The radar was locked on. The system expected a predictable arc. Then the symbol on the glass screen flickered. It moved sideways. It dropped 10,000 feet in a second. Then it leveled off. The radar operator spoke to the tactical action officer. "Sir, contact Sierra 117 is deviating." The officer leaned over the console. "Confirm the track. Is it a sensor ghost?" "Negative." "The signal is solid. It is maneuvering." "That is not possible. A warhead cannot maneuver at Mach 27, 5,000 miles away. Inside a hardened bunker in the Ural Mountains, a Russian colonel watched a different screen. His display showed a perfect green line. The vehicle was responding to its internal guidance. It was skipping off the dense layers of the atmosphere like a stone on a pond. This was the first live test of the maneuvering system against a real-world sensor array. The colonel knew the Americans were watching. He also knew they were confused. Then, the radar operator on the Preble turned pale. 4 more symbols appeared on his screen. They were following the first vehicle. They were spaced precisely 5 miles apart. They were all performing the same impossible turns. The Aegis system began to cycle its logic. It was trying to find a solution for an intercept. The computer returned a terminal error. The target was outside the known engagement envelope. This was the nightmare scenario for Pacific Command. For 30 years, the defense of the United States relied on the predictability of physics. If a missile goes up, it must come down in a specific spot. Now, that math was broken. The 5 vehicles were no longer just test objects. They were ghosts in the machine. They were heading directly toward a high-value impact zone near Hawaii. The tactical action officer on the Preble reached for the secure line to Pearl Harbor. His hand was steady, but his heart was racing. The rules of engagement were written for a different era. He needed a decision in minutes. If he waited, he risked a strike. If he fired, he might start a war. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 7:18 in the morning. The bridge of the USS Preble. Commander Elias Thorne stepped into the Combat Information Center. The room was bathed in blue light. The air was cold. The hum of the cooling fans for the supercomputers was a constant drone. He looked at the main display. He saw the 5 icons. They were jittering. They were not behaving like ballistic missiles. They were behaving like aircraft. But no aircraft could survive at those speeds. The tactical action officer turned to him. "Captain, we have 5 hypersonic glide vehicles. They are designated Sierra 117 through 121. They just performed a coordinated bank at 60 miles of altitude." Thorne looked at the data. "What is the projected impact point?" "The system cannot calculate a point. The objects are changing course every 30 seconds. They are currently headed for the Hawaiian island chain. Are they armed? We have no way of knowing. But their kinetic energy alone is equivalent to a tactical nuclear weapon." Thorne gripped the edge of the console. This was no longer a tracking exercise. This was a potential decapitation strike. If those vehicles were carrying warheads, they could reach Honolulu in less than 6 minutes. The Aegis system was designed to hit targets moving in a straight line, but those missiles were designed to hit targets in space. These Russian vehicles were too low for space interceptors and too fast for traditional air defense. 1,000 miles to the west, a Russian Akula-class submarine sat silent in the deep water. Inside its command center, a technician monitored the American radio frequencies. He heard the burst of encrypted data from the Preble. He reported to his captain, "The Americans are transmitting on the emergency defense net. They are confused by the glide profiles." The captain nodded. "That is the intent. They must learn that their shield is obsolete. We are not here to attack. We are here to demonstrate." Back on the Preble, the radio crackled. It was Pacific Command in Hawaii. The voice was calm but urgent. "Preble, this is Pearl Harbor. We see the tracks. You are authorized to transition to an engagement posture. Do not fire unless the targets cross the 30-mile threshold. We are attempting to contact Moscow on the hotline." Thorne looked at the countdown on his screen. The vehicles were closing the distance at 5 miles every second. The 30-mile threshold was a line in the sky. If the Russians crossed it, the Preble would have to fire. But Thorne knew his missiles might miss. The software was not ready for this. "Lock the fire control radar," Thorne ordered. "Prepare the forward vertical launch cells. I want a firing solution on all 5 targets." The weapons officer hesitated. "Sir, the computer is rejecting the solution. It says the targets are invalid. Override the safety. Use manual lead. We cannot let them reach the islands." The atmosphere in the room tightened. Every sailor knew the stakes. If they fired and missed, they were defenseless. If they fired and hit, they might start a global conflict. The 5 icons on the screen merged into a single wall of red. They were 4 minutes from the threshold. Thorne watched the clock. 7:20 in the morning. The silence in the room was heavier than the sound of the engines. Then, the first vehicle did something even more impossible. It began to climb. 7:21 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Preble. The lead vehicle pulled upward in a violent, sweeping arc. The maneuver defied every rule of high-speed flight. At Mach 27, a turn should have torn the craft apart. Instead, it gripped the thin air and climbed. On the main display of the American destroyer, the red icon representing the threat began to flicker. It turned from a solid red to a blinking yellow. Then, it vanished entirely. The radar operator gripped his controls. He looked at his secondary monitor. "Sir, lost track on Sierra 117. The system is rejecting the sensor data." Commander Thorne moved to the operator's side. "Explain." "We had a 3-dimensional lock. How do we lose a track at this range?" "The Aegis software has a logic gate," the technician explained. His voice was high and tight. "It is programmed to filter out clutter. It expects a ballistic parabola. When the vehicle climbed without an engine burn, the computer flagged the movement as a sensor error. It thinks the target is a ghost. It is deleting the data to clear the processor." Thorne looked at the empty space on the screen. The other 4. What about the rest of the formation? They are all performing the same maneuver. The system is dropping them one by one. "We are going blind, Captain." This was the technical blind spot of the 21st century. The most expensive defense system in history was being defeated by a few lines of code. The Aegis was designed to ignore things that did not make sense. It was designed to filter out birds, clouds, and waves. Now, because the Russian weapons moved in a way that the software considered impossible, the software chose to believe they did not exist. 5,000 miles to the north, in a bunker buried deep beneath the Ural Mountains, Colonel Volkov watched the same event from the opposite side. His screens were not empty. They were filled with telemetry. The 5 glide vehicles were communicating with a satellite overhead. They were sharing data. They were acting as a single, distributed mind. Volkov spoke to his commanding general. "The American radar pulses have changed frequency. They are searching the lower atmosphere. They are looking where the physics says we should be. But our vehicles are already 20 miles above their search grid." The general did not smile. He watched the countdown. The Americans are proud of their technology. They trust their computers more than their eyes. That is their weakness. But be careful. If they cannot see us, they may assume the worst. A blind man with a weapon is the most unpredictable thing in the world. The general was right. On the bridge of the Preble, the silence was heavy. The crew felt the vibration of the engines through the floor. They were a billion-dollar warship with the most advanced sensors on the planet, and they were staring at a blank screen while 5 kinetic hammers fell toward them. "Reset the radar," Thorne ordered. "Force a manual override on the filter gates. I do not care if the screen is messy." "Sir, if I do that, we will see every bird and wave for 100 miles. We will not be able to guide a missile." "Do it anyway. We cannot fight what we cannot see." The technician hit a sequence of keys. The main display exploded with thousands of tiny white dots. It was sensor noise. It was a digital blizzard. Thorne squinted at the mess. He looked for a pattern. He looked for anything that moved faster than the wind. Then, he saw it. 5 distinct streaks of light cutting through the noise. They were no longer climbing. They had reached the peak of their skip. At 160,000 feet, the vehicles pitched their noses down. They were entering the terminal phase. They were diving. The radar operator found his voice. Contact regained. All 5 targets. They are accelerating. Mach 28. Mach 29. They are pointed directly at the impact zone. The countdown hit the 3-minute mark. The weapons were no longer ghosts. They were a reality that the Preble was not prepared to stop. The morning was bright over the Pacific, but the shadow of the incoming strike was growing longer. 7:23 in the morning. The National Military Command Center in Washington. The Situation Room was already crowded. The Secretary of Defense stood before a wall of monitors. He was looking at a live feed from a space-based infrared system satellite. The heat signatures were unmistakable. 5 white plumes were descending toward the Hawaiian Islands. This was no longer a regional incident. It was a national security crisis. The secretary spoke to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. "Is this a confirmed attack?" The chairman shook his head. "We do not know.
How could they have breached the perimeter?"
The Russians announced a test, but the flight path is aggressive. They are maneuvering inside the impact box of our carrier strike group. What are our options? We have a launch on remote protocol. We can use satellite tracking to guide the missiles from the USS Preble, but the targets are moving too fast for a guaranteed kill. The room was silent. The decision was no longer tactical. It was existential. If the United States fired first, it was an act of war. If they waited and the vehicles were armed, they would lose a destroyer and possibly a port. The clock in the corner of the screen showed the countdown. 180 seconds. Back in the Pacific, the USS Preble was rocking in a heavy swell. The ship felt small against the scale of the threat. In the Combat Information Center, the air felt thin. The tactical action officer looked at Commander Thorne. "Sir, we are crossing the Kármán line. The targets are entering the dense atmosphere." Thorne checked his console. "Do we have a satellite link for launch on remote?" "Link is unstable. The plasma sheath around the Verst Russian vehicles is blocking the signal. We have to use our own radar, but the noise is too high. The Kármán line is the edge of space. It is 62 miles up. Once a weapon crosses it, the time for diplomacy ends. The physics of the descent change. The friction creates a wall of fire around the vehicle. This fire is a shield. It blocks radio waves. It hides the weapon from the eyes of the world." Thorne knew the protocol. He had the authority to defend his ship, but he was also a student of history. He knew that many wars started because of a misunderstanding. He spoke into the fleet net. "This is Preble. We are holding fire until 2 minutes out. We need a positive identification of the payload." The response from Pearl Harbor was immediate. "Negative. Preble. You are authorized to engage now. Do not wait for impact. The risk is too high." Thorne looked at his weapons officer. The young man had his thumb on the firing stud. He was waiting for the word. The 5 streaks of light on the manual screen were growing larger. They were no longer dots. They were blades. They were cutting through the sky. 3,800 miles away, in a quiet office in Moscow, a telephone began to ring. It was the direct line to the White House, but the connection was slow. The tension was a physical weight. The world was holding its breath. The countdown reached 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The morning was no longer quiet. The sound of the wind outside the Preble seemed to scream. 7:24 in the morning. The Pacific. The vertical launch system on the forward deck of the USS Preble was ready. Inside the armored cells, the rocket motors of 4 Standard Missile 3 interceptors were primed. These were the most advanced kinetic kill vehicles in the American inventory. They were designed to hit a target the size of a suitcase while moving at 10 times the speed of sound. But they were designed for the vacuum of space. The Russian glide vehicles were now at 110,000 feet. They were in the thin, upper reaches of the atmosphere. This was the edge of the engagement envelope. It was the last moment. The interceptors could be effective. Commander Thorne stood behind the weapons officer. The blue light of the screens reflected in his eyes. He looked at the countdown. 1 minute and 40 seconds to impact. "Weapons," Thorne said. His voice was a low rasp. "Match the tracks. Slave the launch sequence to the manual radar feed." "Sir, the system is still fighting the solution. It is throwing a predictive error. It says the intercept point is inside the atmosphere." "Override it. Use the secondary fire control logic. We are not aiming for a point. We are aiming for a volume of sky." The weapons officer typed a final command. On the deck of the ship, the heavy steel hatches of the launch cells flickered. The cooling systems hissed. The ship was committed. If Thorne gave the order, $30 million of hardware would scream into the sky. 6,000 miles away, the Russian colonel felt the shift in the electronic environment. His sensors detected a spike in high-frequency energy. It was coming from the American destroyer. The USS Preble had transitioned from a search mode to a tracking mode. Its radar was now a narrow, intense beam. It was painting the Russian vehicles. The colonel turned to his commander. "The American ship has a fire control lock. They are seconds away from a launch. They do not realize this is a ballistic test. They think we are targeting them." The general stared at the telemetry. "The trajectory is set. We cannot change the course of the vehicles now. They are in the plasma phase. They are deaf to our commands. Then we must signal the ship. If they fire, our vehicles will perform defensive maneuvers. The debris could hit Hawaii, or worse. The Americans might see the maneuvers as a second attack." The general reached for the secure line to the Russian Ministry of Defense. "Tell them to open the emergency channel to the Pacific Fleet. Tell them the test has reached the critical phase. We are not armed." But the signal had to travel through 5 relay stations. It had to be encrypted and decrypted. It had to be verified. In the world of hypersonic flight, 5 minutes of diplomacy is an eternity. The clock on the Preble did not care about the Russian bureaucracy. Thorne looked at the tactical action officer. "Status of the hotline." "Still silent, sir. Pearl Harbor is reporting a data lag from Washington." "The targets are at 90,000 feet, the radar operator shouted. "They are leveling off. They are not diving. They are skimming." This was the final escalation. By leveling off, the Russian weapons were extending their range. They were no longer falling toward a test range. They were flying toward the heart of the American fleet. Thorne felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He could wait for a phone call that might never come, or he could protect his sailors. He looked at the firing stud. "Confirm the lock," Thorne ordered. "Lock confirmed. Solution is green." "Fire," Thorne said. The ship shuddered as the first missile ignited. The morning sky was torn apart by a pillar of white flame. The crisis had reached the point of no return. 7:26 and 20 seconds in the morning. The deck of the USS Preble. The first Standard Missile 3 cleared the rail, in a roar of orange flame. A second followed 3 seconds later, then a third, then a fourth. The 4 interceptors were streaks of white light against the deep blue of the Pacific sky. They were climbing. They were accelerating. They were hunting. Inside the missiles, the kinetic kill vehicles prepared to separate. They were looking for the heat of the Russian gliders. 7:26 and 50 seconds in the morning. Inside the Russian vehicles, Onboard computers detected the high-frequency pulses of the American interceptor radars. The logic was autonomous. It did not wait for a human command. The vehicles adjusted their flight surfaces. The plasma sheath around them rippled as they changed shape. They did not turn left or right. They dove. They dropped 10,000 feet in 3 seconds. They moved into the denser layers of the atmosphere where the air was thick enough to provide lift. 7:27 and 20 seconds in the morning. The Combat Information Center. The radar operator shouted over the noise of the alarms. Interceptors 1 and 2 are blind. The targets dropped below the search horizon. The seekers cannot lock on. Thorne gripped the back of the operator's chair. Tell them to reacquire. Use the mid-course data link. It is no use, sir. The SM-3s are too high. They are designed for the vacuum. They cannot maneuver in the thick air. They are overshooting. On the main display, the 4 blue icons representing the American missiles sailed harmlessly past the targets. They were miles apart. The most advanced interceptors in the world had just missed. The Russian gliders had used the atmosphere like a shield. They were now at 50,000 feet. They were moving at Mach 20. They were 20 miles from the Preble. 7:27 and 50 seconds in the morning. The bridge. The sound was the first thing they noticed. It was not a whistle. It was a low, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate the very steel of the ship. It was the sound of the air being torn apart. Thorne looked out the forward windows. He saw the streaks in the sky. They were glowing white. They were 5 fingers of fire descending from the heavens. All hands brace for shock, Thorne commanded. He didn't use the intercom. He just yelled. The ship's close-in weapon system, the Phalanx, began to track. The Gatling gun on the deck spun up. It was a desperate, last-second defense. It was designed to stop subsonic cruise missiles. It was never meant for this. The computer was trying to lead a target that was moving faster than a bullet. The barrels began to glow. 7:28 and 10 seconds in the morning. The 5 Russian vehicles were now visible to the naked eye. They were not pointed at the ship. They were pointed at a spot in the ocean exactly 500 meters off the starboard bow. The air pressure was so intense that the water below began to churn before the vehicles even arrived. The heat was blistering. The electronic displays on the bridge flickered and died. The world narrowed down to the sound of the wind and the sight of the fire. The crew on the bridge crouched. They held on to whatever they could find. Thorne stayed upright. He watched the first vehicle hit the water. It was a kinetic impact. The ocean erupted in a tower of white spray and steam that rose 300 feet into the air. The shockwave hit the Preble. The ship heeled over 10 degrees. 7:29 in the morning. The National Military Command Center in Washington. The red telephone on the console of the Secretary of Defense began to flash. It was the Moscow link. The secretary picked it up before the first ring finished. The voice on the other end was not a translator. It was the Russian Minister of Defense. He spoke in English. His voice was thick with the weight of the moment. The minister spoke. Mr. Secretary, do not retaliate. I repeat, do not retaliate. You have just witnessed a system failure. The vehicles were not under human control. The secretary gripped the handset. Minister, you just put 5 hypersonic rounds into the water, 500 meters from an American destroyer. My fleet is in an engagement posture. Explain yourself. It is the perimeter system, the minister said. The automated failsafe. They were programmed to seek a specific acoustic signature in the Pacific. They were targeting an old Soviet sensor buoy near your ship. We lost the override link 10 minutes ago. 7:29 and 30 seconds in the morning. The bridge of the USS Preble. Commander Thorne stood on the bridge wing. The air smelled of ozone and salt. The massive plumes of steam from the impacts were beginning to dissipate. He looked at the water. It was churning. There were no oil slicks. There was no debris. Just 5 deep, circular disturbances in the ocean. The tactical action officer ran onto the bridge. Captain, we are picking up a signal. It is coming from the impact zones. Thorne turned. An active sonar ping. Negative, sir. It is a low-frequency broadcast. It is a digital heartbeat. The vehicles are not weapons. They are relay nodes. They are transmitting a status code back to a satellite. Thorn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The Russians had not been trying to sink his ship. They were testing a dead-hand communication network. This was a system designed to operate after a total nuclear exchange. The vehicles were designed to survive an American intercept, dive into the ocean, and act as an emergency antenna for the Russian submarine fleet. The pivot was now clear to everyone in the room. The USS Preble had not been the target. It had been an obstacle. The Russian computers had seen the American destroyer as a sensor threat and programmed the vehicles to maneuver around its radar coverage. The aggressive moves were not an attack. They were a defensive evasion by an artificial intelligence that did not know the war had not started yet. 7:30 in the morning. The Ural Mountains. Colonel Volkov watched the green lights on his console. All 5 nodes were active on the seafloor. They were successfully transmitting the all-clear signal to the orbital relay. The test was a technical masterpiece, but the colonel was shaking. They launched 4 interceptors. The general nodded slowly, and they missed. But they were not smarter than the men in that room. If the American captain had fired his guns, if he had launched a second wave, we would be in a different world right now. On the Preble, the sirens finally stopped. The red lights in the Combat Information Center faded back to blue. The ship was still intact. The crew was alive. But the silence that followed was not a relief. It was a realization. The gap between human decision-making and machine speed had just narrowed to zero. Thorn looked out at the horizon. The sun was higher now. The Pacific looked peaceful again. But he knew better. He knew that somewhere beneath the waves, 5 Russian machines were still talking to the sky. 7:31 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Preble. The air in the room was thick with the smell of scorched electronics and recycled air. The main display was still a chaotic mess of digital noise. The 5 red icons were gone. In their place were 5 steady, pulsing yellow circles on the sonar display. They were sitting on the seabed. They were silent. They were waiting. Commander Thorn wiped a smear of grease from his forehead. His hands were finally starting to shake. Status of the secondary batteries. The tactical action officer did not look up from his console. Phalanx is in standby. CRAM is safed. We have ceased all active targeting. But sir, the crew is asking what just happened. We just took a near miss from 5 hypersonic rounds. The deck is still vibrating. Tell the crew to maintain their stations, Thorn said. We are in a standoff, not a war. The radio speaker on the bulkhead crackled to life. It was the secure voice of the Admiral at Pacific Command. Preble, this is Pearl Harbor. We have a direct patch from the National Military Command Center. The Kremlin has declared a technical emergency. They are claiming a software override on their perimeter system. You are ordered to hold your position. They are claiming a software override on their perimeter system. You are ordered to hold your position. Do not. I repeat, do not attempt to recover the debris. Thorn leaned into the microphone. Pearl, this is Preble. We have 5 active acoustic nodes on the seafloor. They are transmitting. If these are communication relays, they are currently talking to every Russian submarine in the Pacific Basin. Are we just going to let them broadcast? The sound of static filled the room. Preble, the decision is being made at the cabinet level. For now, you are a witness. Maintain a 3,000-yard standoff. If those nodes move, or if you detect a launch from the seafloor, you are cleared to engage, with depth charges. Otherwise, we wait. Thorn turned to his sonar officer. Can we triangulate the broadcast?
Very good.
Yes, sir.
Of course.
It is a repeating burst. It is heavily encrypted. But the frequency is strange. It is designed to penetrate deep water. It is a wake-up call. Captain, whatever is on those nodes, it is telling the Russian fleet that the world has changed. 3,000 miles to the north, the Russian Akula-class submarine drifted in the darkness of the Aleutian Trench. Inside the hull, the captain listened to the acoustic pulses, coming from the south. He did not need a codebreaker to understand the intent. The pulses were a heartbeat. They were proof that the new delivery system worked. The American shield had failed to stop the message. The Russian captain turned to his executive officer. The Americans think this was an accident. They want to believe it was a malfunction, because the alternative is too difficult to accept. They want to believe their Aegis system is still relevant. And if they find the nodes, sir, they will not find them. The nodes are programmed to self-destruct if the casing is breached. In 1 hour, they will dissolve into the salt water. All that will remain is the data they sent, and the memory of the fire in the sky. Back on the Preble, Thorne walked out onto the bridge wing. The steam from the impacts had cleared. The ocean looked like glass. He looked down at the water. Somewhere beneath that calm surface, the future of warfare was screaming in a language he could not understand. He had saved his ship. He had prevented a war. But as he watched the sun climb over the horizon, he did not feel like a victor. The radar operator came over the internal circuit. "Captain, we have a new contact. High altitude. Coming from the north. It is not Russian." Thorne felt his stomach drop. "Identify." "It is a global hawk. Our own drone. Washington is sending in the sensors. They want to see what we missed." Thorne looked up. He could not see the drone. 7:35 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Preble. The wind had died down. The heavy salt spray from the impacts had settled back into the sea. Across the deck, sailors who had been braced for a catastrophic explosion began to stand up. Their movements were slow. The adrenaline was leaving their systems. It left behind a cold and hollow exhaustion. They looked at each other with the wide eyes of men who had seen the end of the world and were surprised to still be standing in the sun. Inside the Combat Information Center, the radar screens were finally clear. The digital blizzard had vanished. The manual overrides were no longer necessary, but the data remained on the hard drives. Commander Thorne stood in front of the master display. He watched the replay of the engagement on a loop. The blue lines, representing the American interceptors, climbed toward the sky. The red lines of the Russian gliders dove beneath them. It looked like a choreographed dance. One side was moving in 3 dimensions. The other side was stuck in 2. The sonar officer spoke up. "Captain, the acoustic pulses are changing. The frequency is dropping." Thorne moved to the station. "Is it a new command?" "Negative, sir. It sounds like a power-down sequence. The signal is fading into the background noise of the ocean. It is a controlled shutdown." 2 miles beneath the surface, the 5 Russian nodes were completing their final phase. The magnesium casings were reacting with the salt water in a pre-planned chemical burn. The internal circuits were melting into a featureless sludge. The technology was erasing itself. In 30 minutes, there would be nothing left for a recovery team to find. No circuit boards, no guidance chips, no proof of the maneuverable logic. The Russians had demonstrated a weapon that could penetrate the most expensive defense system in history. They had bypassed the Aegis threshold. Then, they had deleted the evidence. It was a strategic masterstroke. They had proven they could strike. They had also proven they could choose not to. 1,000 miles away, the American Global Hawk drone arrived on station. Its high-resolution cameras scanned the water. It saw only the rolling waves. It saw the USS Preble sitting alone in the vast blue. The drone began to circle at 60,000 feet. It was a silent witness to a battlefield that was already empty. The infrared sensors picked up the lingering heat in the water, where the vehicles had splashed down. But even that was fading. Thorne walked back to the bridge. He looked at his watch. 20 minutes had passed since the first detection on Hainan Island. In 20 minutes, the strategic balance of the Pacific had shifted. The Aegis system was still functional. Its radars were still spinning. Its missiles were still in their cells. But the confidence of the men who operated it was gone. They knew now that the shield was not absolute. They knew the math had changed. The weapons officer approached Thorne on the bridge wing. He looked at the empty sea where he had almost started a war. "Sir, how do we log the interceptors? Was it a hardware failure?" Thorne shook his head. "No. The missiles did exactly what they were programmed to do. They flew to a coordinate in space. The problem is that the target was no longer in space. The failure was not in the hardware, it was in our imagination. We built a wall for a world that does not exist anymore." He looked at the horizon. The sun was a bright and hard disk now. The morning was beautiful. The water was calm. But Thorn felt a new kind of tension. It was the tension of a man who realized that the rules of the game had been rewritten while he was playing it. Secure from general quarters, Thorn ordered. Set condition 3 throughout the ship. I want a full tactical download sent to Pearl Harbor. And get me a cup of coffee. It is going to be a long day. The emergency was over. The physical danger had passed. But as the Preble turned back toward its patrol box, the silence on the bridge felt different. It was the silence of a transition. The era of ballistic certainty was over. The era of hypersonic doubt had begun. 8:45 in the morning. The wardroom of the USS Preble. Commander Thorn sat at the head of the table. Around him were his department heads. They were not looking at each other. They were looking at the digital tablet. In the center of the table, it showed the side-by-side telemetry of the engagement. On the left was the sensor data from the Aegis system. On the right was the raw, unfiltered feed from the manual radar override. The comparison was damning. The Aegis data showed 5 clean breaks where the system simply stopped tracking. The manual feed showed 5 continuous, jagged lines. Those lines represented the 5 Russian glide vehicles. They had performed a series of S-turns that bled off velocity while maintaining a constant altitude. It was a maneuver designed to confuse the Doppler filters of every Western interceptor. The weapons officer cleared his throat. Sir, the analysis is clear. Our fire control logic was looking for a ballistic re-entry vehicle. A BRV falls. It does not glide. When the Russian targets maintained altitude at Mach 20, the software classified them as environmental clutter. It thought they were clouds or ionized air. By the time we forced a manual lock, the targets were already inside the minimum intercept range of our SM-3 missiles. Thorn leaned back. So, the system worked perfectly. It just worked on the wrong set of rules. Yes, sir, the officer replied. We call it the Aegis Gap. It is a fundamental flaw in how we define a threat. We built a shield that is only effective if the enemy plays by the rules of 1980s physics. The Russians just changed the rules. 9:15 in the morning. Pacific Command. Pearl Harbor. The admiral stood in a darkened room known as the Pit. This was the nerve center for all American operations in the Pacific. On the giant screen, the replay of the Preble's encounter was being analyzed by a team of civilian engineers. They were from the Missile Defense Agency. They were not military. They were mathematicians, and they were terrified. One of the engineers pointed to a spike in the data. Look at the heat signature here. The Russian vehicle is using the plasma sheath as a sensor mask. It is literally hiding behind the fire it creates. Our infrared seekers were looking for a hot point. Instead, they saw a wall of heat 5 miles wide. The admiral crossed his arms. It is like trying to shoot a specific bird inside a forest fire. Can we patch the software? We can try, Admiral. We can try, Admiral. But this is not a bug. It is a feature of hypersonic flight. To hit these things, we need a different kind of missile. We need something that can fly in the atmosphere as well as they do. Right now, we are throwing rocks at ghosts. 10:30 in the morning. The Ural Mountains. Colonel Volkov was finishing his formal report. He was sitting in a small, windowless office. The adrenaline of the morning had been replaced by a quiet, professional satisfaction. He looked at the final slide of his presentation. It showed the USS Preble as seen from the camera of the lead glide vehicle. The ship looked small and fragile. It was a billion-dollar target that had no idea it was being watched from 60 miles up. His general entered the room. He was carrying a glass of tea. The ministry is pleased, Volkov. The Americans have officially requested a technical exchange to discuss the accident. They are calling it a safety concern. But we know what they are really asking. They want to know how we did it. And will we tell them, General? The general smiled. We will tell them enough to keep them afraid. That is the point of the perimeter system. It is not just about destruction. It is about the message. We have shown them that their front door is unlocked. Now, we wait to see if they try to build a better door. Volkov nodded. He knew that the arms race had just entered a new phase. For 30 years, the world had lived under the umbrella of ballistic missiles. Those missiles were fast, but they were predictable. Now, the sky was filled with things that could choose where to land. The era of the Aegis Gap had begun, and it would take a generation to close it. Back on the Preble, Thorne walked out onto the deck. The sun was high and hot. He looked at the forward launch cells. They were closed. They looked solid. They looked dependable. But he knew the truth. He knew that if the 5 red icons came back tomorrow, he would be standing on the same deck, watching the same fire, and hoping for the same luck. 3 days later, 10 o'clock in the morning, the Pentagon. The conference room was windowless and soundproof. It was buried 4 levels beneath the Virginia soil. On the polished oak table sat a single red folder. It contained the after-action report from the USS Preble. The title was printed in bold black letters. The Aegis Threshold. The Admiral skimmed the summary. Give me the bottom line. Was this a Russian hack? The lead analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency shook his head. No, sir. There was no intrusion. The Russian vehicles used a natural phenomenon. They manipulated the boundary layer of the atmosphere. They created a sensor blind spot that our systems are not programmed to see. It is not a software bug. It is a fundamental limit of our current radar technology. The Admiral leaned forward. So you are telling me that $500 billion of missile defense is useless against a glide vehicle? Not useless, sir, but it is reactive. We are playing a game of catch-up. The Russians have moved the battle from space into the upper atmosphere. Our interceptors are built for the vacuum. They are like high-speed trains. They are very fast, but they cannot turn. The Russian gliders are like birds. They can change direction whenever they want. Until we build a bird of our own, we are wide open. The Admiral looked at the screen. It showed the tracks of the Russian vehicles. They looked like jagged scars across the map of the Pacific. The President wants to know if we can stop them if they try again tomorrow. The analyst hesitated. The honest answer, sir, we would have to launch 20 missiles for every one of theirs. And even then, the math is not in our favor. The cost of the defense is 10 times the cost of the attack. That is a war we cannot afford to win. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Moscow. The Russian Minister of Defense stood by the window of his office. He could see the red stars on the Kremlin towers. He felt a sense of immense relief. The accident had achieved its objective without a single shot being fired. The hotline calls were over. The diplomatic protests were being filed, but the message had been received. He spoke to his aide. The Americans are already moving more ships into the region. They are doubling the patrols. Does that concern you, Minister? No, the minister said. It is a sign of their anxiety. They are trying to hide behind a wall that they know is broken. They will spend billions of dollars to upgrade their software. They will rewrite their rules of engagement. But they cannot change the fact that for 10 minutes on a Tuesday morning, we held their most advanced warship at our mercy. The psychological barrier has been breached. 6 o'clock in the evening, Pearl Harbor. The USS Preble sat quietly at the pier. The hull was stained with salt, but the ship looked strong. Its radar arrays were still. Commander Thorne stood on the pier, looking up at the forward missile deck. He remembered the sound of the Standard Missile 3 launch. He remembered the roar of the fire. A junior officer walked up beside him. The crew is being debriefed, sir. They are being told it was a sensor calibration error on the Russian side. A malfunction. Thorne looked at the officer. Do they believe it? They want to believe it, sir. It makes the world feel safer. The world is not safe, Thorne said quietly. It is just quiet. For now. He turned away from the ship and looked out toward the mouth of the harbor. The sun was setting. The water was a deep, bruised purple. He knew that somewhere out there, the game was still being played. The machines were learning. The engineers were coding. And the next time the sky caught fire, there would be no hotline to stop it. 11:15 in the morning, the Naval War College, Rhode Island. The lecture hall was silent. On the screen was a single image of the Pacific Ocean. It was a satellite photo of the USS Preble. The ship looked like a small white needle in a vast blue field. The speaker was a retired admiral. He did not use a pointer. He just stood there. He looked at the graduating class of tactical officers. These were the men and women who would command the next generation of American destroyers. What you saw 3 weeks ago was not a failure of equipment, the admiral said. His voice was projected through the room without a microphone. The Aegis system performed exactly as it was designed. The missiles launched, the radars tracked, the sailors did their duty, but we still lost the engagement. We lost because we were fighting a war that exists in textbooks. The Russians were fighting a war that exists in the physics of the future. He paused. He let the words sink in. The Aegis threshold is a term you will hear often. It is the point where the speed of the weapon exceeds the speed of the logic. When a machine can maneuver at Mach 25, the human mind is no longer part of the kill chain. We are just observers. The only thing that saved the Preble was not a computer. It was the restraint of a single commander who chose not to trust his screen. 1,000 miles away, in the middle of the Atlantic, another American destroyer was on patrol. Its radar was spinning. Its computers were processing millions of data points every second. Inside the Combat Information Center, a young officer watched a flickering icon on his display. It was a bird, or a cloud, or a ghost. He hesitated. He remembered the briefing from the Preble. He did not hit the alarm. He waited. He used his eyes. In Moscow, the Russian Ministry of Defense released a short statement. It spoke of a successful test of the Avangard system. It mentioned the cooperation of the American fleet in ensuring the safety of the impact zone. It was a lie. Both sides knew it was a lie. But it was a necessary lie. It allowed the world to continue as if the rules still applied. It allowed the leaders to sleep. The admiral at the War College turned off the screen. Modern warfare is no longer decided by who has the biggest gun. It is decided by who has the best math. And right now, the math is changing every hour. We are entering an era of hypersonic doubt. You must learn to live in that doubt. You must learn that your sensors are a suggestion, not a fact. The students began to pack their bags. They talked in low voices. They were already thinking about the new software patches. They were thinking about the new interceptor designs. They were thinking about the next time the sky would catch fire. Commander Thorne was not in the room. He was back at sea. He was standing on the bridge of the Preble. The ship was heading west. It was moving toward the edge of the horizon. He looked at the radar display. It was clear. The ocean was empty. But he did not look away. He kept his hand near the radio. He kept his eyes on the sky. He knew that the next falling star might not be a star at all. It might be a message, and he was the only one left to read it. The strategic assessment was finished. The lesson was learned. The world was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of a long breath. It was the silence before the next maneuver.